They were just an ordinary young family, barely making enough to pay rent and buy food. But when they were offered an abandoned crime family mansion for only $250, they decided to take the risk. What they found inside changed their lives forever. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories, and be sure to tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The salt air always carried the smell of something old in the little town of Seabrook, as if every gust of wind off the Atlantic had a memory to deliver. It moved through the narrow streets, around the leaning poles and weather-worn porches, whispering through the cracks of houses that had seen better decades. For Marcus Blake, that smell had long since stopped being romantic. It was the smell of fatigue, the scent of his endless routine between the car shop, the docks, and the trailer park that clung to the edge of the highway like an afterthought. His life, much like the rusting pickup he drove, had learned to move despite the noise. Marcus was 32, with a body hardened by work and eyes that had grown used to measuring time by shifts, not hours. His wife, Tiffany, 28, had that quiet strength that comes from too many early mornings and too few breaks. She worked double shifts at a diner called the Blue Gull, where she poured coffee for fishermen, truckers, and tourists who never looked up long enough to see how tired she was. Together, they were the sort of couple people passed without notice, a pair of survivors, not dreamers. But even those who had long stopped believing in luck sometimes stumbled upon it when the world least cared. It happened one Thursday afternoon in late October, when Marcus, sitting in the car with a sandwich wrapped in grease paper, flipped through a discarded local paper. Between the ads for used boats and missing dogs, his eyes caught a line that seemed almost absurd. Property sale, confiscated by the state, oceanfront structure, $250, immediate transfer. He read it twice, thinking it must be a typo. $250 for anything on Seabrook's shoreline was laughable. The ocean was where the money lived, where retired lawyers built glass houses, and where locals like him were only ever hired to fix their plumbing. Yet the address printed at the bottom was real. He recognized it vaguely. Shoreline Drive, last property before the cliffs. That stretch was famous, not for its beauty, but for its ghosts. When Tiffany came home late that evening, her hands smelling of fryer oil and detergent, he showed her the ad. She laughed at first. $250? For what? A shack? But when he opened the old laptop and pulled up the satellite image, the laughter died. The building looked enormous. Faded gray roof lines spread across what seemed like acres. Even from the pixelated view, they could see columns, terraces, and the faint glimmer of a pool. "It has to be a mistake," Tiffany said, but there was hesitation in her voice. She had learned not to believe in miracles, but part of her still wanted to. Marcus shrugged. "If it's a mistake, we'll drive there and laugh about it on the way back." The next morning, they drove out of town before sunrise. The road hugged the coastline, the dawn still bleeding red across the water. The pickup rattled over potholes, its engine coughing in protest. They had no music on, only the sound of wind pressing through the open crack of the window and the muffled rush of the sea somewhere beyond the dunes. Tiffany held the folded ad in her lap like a fragile ticket to a world that couldn't possibly exist. As they approached the address, the houses grew larger, cleaner, and more distant from one another. The lawns were trimmed, the fences white and unchipped. But the closer they came to the end of Shoreline Drive, the more the illusion broke down. Cracked sidewalks gave way to overgrown grass, and the last streetlight leaned sideways, its glass broken. The neighborhood seemed to end in exhaustion, Then they saw it. The mansion rose behind a rusted iron gate, its pillars veiled in climbing ivy, its once white facade the color of sea fog. The windows, tall and arched, reflected nothing. Even in daylight, it seemed to absorb the light rather than catch it. A pair of stone lions flanked the entrance, their faces eroded by decades of salt wind. The gate itself was chained shut with a heavy padlock, and on it hung a fading notice. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The ocean roared faintly beyond the hill, the only sound breaking the silence. Tiffany looked at the massive structure and then at Marcus. This can't be it. But it was. The numbers on the old stone arch matched the address from the ad exactly. A man in a city-issued windbreaker appeared from behind the gate. He was thin, with a clipboard and a look that suggested he'd long since stopped expecting anyone to show up. "You hear about the property?" he asked, as if surprised to hear his own question answered after so many years. Marcus nodded. "We saw the ad." The man chuckled dryly. "You and maybe 3 people in the last decade. You're serious about this?" "We just want to see it," Marcus said carefully. "Suit yourself." The man unlocked the gate and pushed it open with effort. The hinges screamed in protest. "Just don't expect much. It's been sitting since the city took it. Belonged to the Costa family. Remember them?" Marcus shook his head. Tiffany frowned. "Were they rich?" "Rich?" The man gave a short laugh that sounded closer to disbelief. "They owned half the docks and a good portion of the town's bad memories. Old man Costa was a big name in the 80s. Ran a shipping business, or so the paperwork said. Everyone knew better. Smuggling, racketeering, you name it. His son disappeared after a police raid. The old man turned up dead in the study, and the house has been rotten ever since. Some say there's money buried somewhere inside. Others say whoever goes looking doesn't stay long enough to find it." Tiffany felt a chill, though the sun was climbing. "So why hasn't the city sold it before?" The man shrugged. "Tried. Every buyer backed out. Accidents, break-ins, strange happenings, whatever you want to call it. People around here think the place is cursed. We just want it off the books." He gestured towards the sprawling ruin. "You cover the back taxes and sign a few forms, and it's yours. $250 all in." It was absurd. Too absurd to be a scam, too strange to ignore. Marcus glanced at his wife. Her brow was furrowed, but she wasn't saying no. "We'll think about it," he said. As they walked back towards the truck, Tiffany stopped to look at the mansion one last time. The ocean wind tugged at her hair, carrying the faint echo of gulls and the rhythmic crash of waves. The house loomed like something alive, wounded but waiting. "Marcus," she said quietly, "it's falling apart." He smiled faintly. "So are we. Maybe it's a match." They didn't talk much on the drive home, but something had shifted between them. Not hope exactly, something smaller, humbler, like a spark under ashes. That night, Tiffany couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the far-off sound of freight trains and the steady breathing of her husband beside her. The image of the house kept rising behind her eyes. The cracked windows, the way the light had hit the ivy, the silence that felt almost intentional. By morning, she already knew what Marcus would say before he said it. They both knew they didn't have the money to fix it, but they also knew that if they didn't take the chance, someone else eventually would, and they would spend the rest of their lives wondering what might have been hiding behind those walls. They signed the papers at City Hall 2 days later. The clerk processed their payment without a hint of ceremony. "Congratulations," he said flatly, stamping the last page. You now own Seabrook's most unwanted real estate." When they left the building, the rain had just started. A slow, misty drizzle that blurred the edges of everything. Tiffany laughed quietly under her breath. "We just bought a haunted mansion." Marcus slipped the keys into his pocket. "No," he said, though his voice was uncertain. "We bought a house by the ocean." They returned to the property the next day, this time with their meager possessions loaded into the truck. A mattress, 2 chairs, a box of kitchenware, and a framed photo of Tiffany's late mother. The drive felt longer this time, maybe because they both understood what it meant. There would be no going back. The gate opened with a reluctant groan when Marcus turned the new key. The house seemed to exhale at their arrival as though it had been holding its breath for 20 years. Inside, the air was thick with dust and salt. Their footsteps echoed through vast, empty rooms. There were chandeliers without crystals, curtains stiff with mildew, and walls where the wallpaper had peeled into curling tongues. But beneath the decay, there was structure. Bones. Beautiful ones. Tiffany walked through the main hall, running her fingers over the cracked marble. "It used to be beautiful," she said softly. They unpacked slowly, turning one of the smaller sitting rooms into a makeshift living space. By nightfall, the house had grown colder, and the sound of waves reached them through the cracked windows like a constant whisper. Tiffany lit a candle when the power failed. The flame flickered, reflecting in the dusty glass of a framed mirror. For a second, she thought she saw movement behind her. Just a trick of the light, she told herself, but it was enough to make her shiver. They ate dinner sitting on the floor, backs against the wall, plates balanced on their knees. Outside, the wind began to rise. The shutters clattered softly, and somewhere deep in the house a door slammed. Marcus frowned, listening, but when he went to check, the corridor was empty. The first night was long. Sleep came in fragments between creaks and sighs, between gusts of wind and the low thrum of the tide beneath the cliffs. Tiffany woke once to the sound of dripping water and found herself staring at the ceiling where the shadows moved like waves. It wasn't fear she felt exactly, but an awareness, a sense that the house was watching, assessing, remembering. When dawn came, the world outside was silver blue, the ocean shining through the broken shutters. Tiffany stood at the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. The horizon stretched endlessly, and for a moment she felt something she hadn't felt in years, possibility. Marcus joined her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "So," he said quietly, "what do you think?" She smiled faintly. "I think it's going to need everything we have." He nodded. "Then it's already better than what we had before." The house seemed to breathe again as the morning light filled its empty rooms. Dust motes swirled like sparks in the air. Outside, gulls circled above the cliffs, their cries sharp and distant. Below, the tide began to rise, the waves reaching closer to the edge of the crumbling seawall. The Blakes didn't know it yet, but the moment they crossed that threshold, the past had begun to stir. The Costa mansion had been silent for decades, its secrets buried under plaster and salt. Now, for the first time in years, there were voices again. Soft, human, alive. The ocean pressed against the shore like a heartbeat, and somewhere, deep within the house, behind walls no one had touched in a generation, something faintly shifted, like a door moving ever so slightly on its hinges. The mansion had been bought for $250, but the price it would ask of them had only begun to reveal itself. The ocean's breath filled every corner of the mansion by morning. The salty wind seeped through the cracks of the windows, brushing against the curtains that had long turned stiff from moisture. When Tiffany woke, she could hear the slow, rhythmic pulse of waves beneath the cliffs, as though the sea itself was whispering through the bones of the house. It was not quiet here. Even in stillness, the house was alive with sound. The groan of wood, the rattle of shutters, the faint hum of unseen spaces shifting under pressure. Marcus had been up since dawn, already covered in a film of dust. He had opened every door on the first floor, letting light pour into places that had been sealed for decades. Sunlight revealed more than it comforted. The once polished marble floors were scuffed and cracked, the walls lined with faded portraits whose faces had almost disappeared beneath grime. Yet there was dignity in the decay. Each room still carried traces of grandeur. The heavy oak frames, the intricate molding, the faint scent of old cologne lingering in one of the upper hallways. Tiffany stood in the grand foyer, holding her coffee cup close. The stairway curved upward like a rib cage, its banisters smooth under her fingers, but cold, lifeless. She felt small under the ceiling, where the chandelier hung tilted, most of its crystals missing. The air was heavy but not hostile. It was simply filled, with years, with silence, with the kind of memory that doesn't fade just because people leave. By mid-morning, Marcus was working in what had once been the dining room. He'd cleared away fallen plaster and found beneath it a fireplace, blackened but intact. "There's structure under all this," he said, striking at the wall with a crowbar. "Good bones. Whoever built this place didn't do it cheap." Tiffany nodded absently. Her eyes had caught something else. On the far wall, where the wallpaper had peeled away in strips, she saw faint outlines of words scratched into the plaster. She leaned closer, brushing the dust away. It wasn't English, not entirely. The letters seemed half erased, but she could make out fragments. Familia Silencio. She said nothing. Maybe it was a superstition not to speak such discoveries aloud. Instead, she turned toward the massive windows that looked out to the beach. The tide was low now, the sand glistening like a mirror. For the first time, she wondered how many had walked that same shoreline from this house. How many watched the ocean as she did now, waiting for something to come back that never did. They spent the day cleaning what they could. The dust came off the furniture in gray clouds, coating their faces and clothes. The house creaked as if irritated by the disturbance. Every door they opened seemed to sigh. And yet, under the fatigue and the strangeness, there was satisfaction. They were claiming something long forgotten. It was near dusk when Tiffany went into the kitchen. The room was a ruin of corroded pipes and broken tiles, but on the counter she found a cluster of old newspapers, brittle and yellowed, bound together by twine. Curiosity made her untie them. The first headline nearly made her drop the bundle. Costa family empire collapses. Authorities investigate missing heir. Another read, "Bodies found off Seabrook Cliff. Ties to smuggling suspected." The photographs were grainy but recognizable. She could see the very same house in the background of one image, gleaming and new, the ocean sparkling behind it. A tall man in a white suit stood beside a woman holding a champagne glass. He looked confident, untouchable. The caption below identified him as Vincenzo Costa, patriarch of the Costa family, owner of Atlantic Freight and Maritime. Tiffany's throat went dry. The smiling woman in the photo wore pearls and gloves, her hair sculpted in the fashion of another era. Between them stood two boys, one around 12, the other perhaps 8. Both had the same eyes as the man. She could almost imagine their laughter filling the very halls where she now stood. She brought the papers to Marcus. He wiped his hands on his jeans and scanned the headlines, his brow furrowing. "This is him," he murmured. "The old man they talked about. Costa." He turned the pages, reading bits of text. Smuggling, bribes, tax evasion. Hell, this guy was practically running a private empire. Tiffany pointed to a smaller article near the bottom. Authorities suspect documents destroyed before raid. Investigators find evidence of hidden storage. Marcus looked at her, the connection dawning slowly. "You think it's still here?" "I think this house still remembers," she said quietly. That night they lit candles again, since the wiring still flickered unpredictably. The house grew darker, the corners swallowed by shadow. As they ate canned soup at the kitchen table, a sudden thump echoed above them. Tiffany froze. "Did you hear that?" Marcus looked up, spoon midair. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, like footsteps crossing the upstairs hallway. He set the spoon down and stood. "Probably something fell," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. He took the flashlight and climbed the staircase. Each step groaned under his weight, the beam of light cutting through dust motes thick as fog. The long corridor stretched ahead, lined with closed doors. At the end, a window rattled in the wind, tapping rhythmically against the frame. He exhaled, feeling a foolish relief, and pushed it shut. When he turned, however, one of the doors, one he was sure had been closed, now stood slightly ajar. He stepped toward it slowly. Inside was a small study, or what had been one. Shelves lined the walls, most empty except for a few scattered books warped by moisture. The desk near the window was overturned. He crouched beside it and noticed something odd about the wall behind. There was a rectangular patch where the paint looked newer, smoother. When he knocked on it, the sound was hollow. "Tiff," he called softly, his voice echoing faintly. "Come up here." She joined him, barefoot, holding a candle that quivered in the draft. Together they examined the wall. "It's been sealed," Marcus said. "Not too long ago either." He fetched a hammer from the bag they'd brought for repairs. The first strike sent dust raining from the ceiling. The second revealed metal beneath the plaster, a dull, gray surface that shimmered faintly under the candlelight. It was a safe, built into the wall with no visible handle, no numbers, just a keyhole the size of a dime. Marcus ran his fingers along the edges. "Whatever's in here, someone wanted it buried." Tiffany's pulse quickened. She looked over her shoulder at the dark hallway, half expecting to see someone standing there. The candlelight danced against the empty walls. "Maybe we should leave it for tomorrow," she whispered, but Marcus shook his head. He pried at the metal seam with a screwdriver, chipping away what plaster he could, but the door wouldn't budge. After a few minutes, he leaned back, breathing hard. "We'll need tools, real ones." They returned downstairs, but the air had changed. The warmth from the candles now seemed faint, swallowed by drafts that came from nowhere. Somewhere, deep inside the house, a door creaked open. Tiffany turned toward the sound instinctively, her heart thudding. "Probably the wind," Marcus muttered again, though his tone had lost its conviction. They went to bed late, exhaustion finally overtaking curiosity, but the house did not sleep. Every few hours, Tiffany woke to the sound of shifting boards, faint movements overhead. Once, she thought she heard a whisper, not words exactly, but the cadence of speech carried on the wind. She reached for Marcus, who stirred and pulled her closer. "It's just settling," he mumbled. But in her half-dreaming mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was not settling. It was remembering. In the following days, they began working on restoring the power. Marcus spent hours tracing old cables and fuses while Tiffany cleaned room after room. Each revealed fragments of lives once lived here. A child's marble under a radiator, a silk scarf decayed to threads, a framed photo half melted by sun and humidity. The deeper they went, the more it felt like the house was slowly unveiling itself. In the library, Tiffany found an old globe covered in dust. When she spun it gently, it creaked, and a small folded piece of paper fell from the hollow inside. She unfolded it, revealing a crude hand-drawn map of the coastline. There was an X marked near the very spot where their property met the beach cliffs. Beside it, written in elegant script, was a single phrase: "For my sons." When Marcus returned that evening, she showed him. He stared at the map for a long time. "Maybe it's just sentimental," he said, but his tone betrayed something else: excitement, maybe, or fear. They decided to search the cliffs at low tide. The sand there was hard-packed, littered with driftwood and broken shells. Gulls wheeled overhead, crying as though mocking their search. For an hour they found nothing, only rocks and water, until Marcus's foot struck something hollow beneath the sand near a collapsed outbuilding. They dug with their hands until metal gleamed through. It was an old oil drum, rusted shut. Inside, beneath layers of sand and salt, lay a single tin box wrapped in plastic. They carried it back to the house, setting it on the dining table. Tiffany peeled back the plastic and opened the box. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Families at dinners, men in suits shaking hands, the same house always visible in the background. But not all the photos were innocent. Some showed men with weapons, money being counted, faces blurred in motion. There were also letters, all unsigned, written in a bold, hurried hand. Phrases jumped from the pages. "They're closing in." "The boy is missing." "The documents must never leave this house." The candle flickered as Marcus read. "They were hiding something huge," he whispered. Tiffany looked up, her expression unreadable. "Or protecting it." The wind outside rose suddenly, banging one of the shutters against the window frame. Both flinched. The house moaned as if in response. For a moment, it felt as though the very walls were listening, waiting to see what they would do next. That night, Tiffany dreamed of water. She saw the house from above, half submerged, the sea rising through the floors, lifting chairs and papers and photographs like ghosts returning home. When she woke, the sound of the surf was so loud it felt like it was coming from beneath the floorboards. Marcus was already up, sitting in the hallway, staring at the sealed wall upstairs. "I've been thinking," he said without turning. "That safe. It's not just metal. It's part of the wall itself. Whoever built this house made sure it would never be opened easily." "Maybe we're not supposed to open it," Tiffany said softly. He looked at her then, his eyes tired but determined. Then why would the key still be here? He held up something she hadn't noticed before, a small, ornate key he'd found that morning wedged under one of the stair treads. Its head was shaped like a wave. For a long moment, they said nothing. The wind moved through the broken panes, carrying with it the cry of the ocean. Somewhere within the mansion, the faintest sound echoed back, metal against metal, a memory waking. The morning after the discovery of the small ornate key arrived gray and muted. with low clouds crawling across the ocean and rain threatening to fall at any moment. The air felt thick and motionless, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what the Blakes would do next. Marcus sat at the dining table with the key between his fingers, turning it over and over, studying every curve and groove. It was heavier than it looked, carved with delicate lines that seemed almost alive when caught in the dim light filtering through the cracked window. Tiffany stood nearby, her arms crossed, watching him in silence. Neither had slept much. Every sound in the house had been amplified through the night. The groaning wood, the distant crash of waves, the subtle rustle that might have been the wind or something else entirely. "We don't know what's in there," she said finally, her voice low but steady. Marcus looked up. "That's exactly why we have to find out." He rose and went to the wall upstairs, where the hidden safe waited like a heartbeat behind plaster. The air in the corridor was colder than downstairs, as though the upper floor belonged to another season entirely. He knelt, brushed away the remaining dust from the metal plate, and slid the key into the hole. It fit perfectly. For a long moment he hesitated, hand resting on the key, and then turned it. The lock gave a sharp, metallic click that echoed down the hall like a gunshot. The door creaked open, releasing a rush of stale air that smelled faintly of rust and something older. Salt, maybe, or decay. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Marcus lifted it carefully and carried it into the light. Tiffany joined him, holding her breath. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal several envelopes, thick with age, and a folded piece of paper that appeared to be a map. On the first envelope, written in slanted, fading ink, were the words, "For my sons." They exchanged a glance, that same unspoken awareness that had followed them ever since they entered this house, a sense that they were intruding not just into space, but into time itself. Marcus opened the envelope slowly, careful not to tear the brittle paper. Inside were handwritten pages filled with dense writing, dated nearly 40 years ago. The handwriting was elegant but frantic in parts, as though written under pressure. He began to read aloud. "If you are reading this, then the house has outlived us all. I built this place to face the ocean, believing I could outlast the tides. But I was wrong. The tides always win. Beneath the cliff there is a tunnel, old, carved through rock when this coast was still free land. It was used to move things no one was meant to see. Keep the path closed, my sons. Some doors, once opened, can never be sealed again." Marcus lowered the letter, his pulse quickening. Tiffany frowned. "A tunnel?" she repeated. "What kind of tunnel?" "The kind you dig when you have too much to hide," he said quietly. He opened the folded map that had been tucked alongside the letters. It was hand-drawn, with faint red lines marking the mansion and a narrow path leading from the basement to the edge of the shore. At the far end, the line ended in a black mark labeled only the vault. That afternoon, armed with flashlights and a crowbar, Marcus led the way down to the basement. The air there was damp and heavy with mold. The stone walls wept with condensation, and the ground sloped slightly downward toward the ocean. In one corner, under a pile of collapsed crates, he found a section of wall that didn't match the rest. It was newer, smoother, and when he struck it lightly with the crowbar, it sounded hollow. "This is it," he murmured. Tiffany hesitated at the stairs. "Are you sure we should—" But before she could finish, Marcus swung the crowbar hard. The wall cracked, sending a puff of cold air through the room. A second blow, and a section of stone fell inward with a dull thud. Beyond it yawned a black void. A tunnel stretched ahead, narrow and descending, the air inside colder still. The flashlight beam revealed dripping walls lined with old wooden supports. It smelled of earth, brine, and time. Tiffany joined him reluctantly, the beam of her own light trembling as she stepped closer. "It feels like the ocean's breathing down here," she whispered. They moved slowly, their footsteps crunching on the damp floor. The tunnel twisted deeper into the ground, the ceiling so low that Marcus had to stoop. At one point, they passed a rusted cart on a broken rail, its sides marked with faded stencils of numbers. There were remnants of old crates, rope, and tools scattered in the dirt. Everything was covered in About 50 feet in, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. The beam of the flashlight caught glints of metal, barrels, dozens of them, stacked and toppled in disarray. Some bore customs seals long eaten away by rust. Marcus pried one open. Inside were only fragments of what looked like paper, soaked and fused together over decades. He opened another, and this time found glass bottles, their contents long evaporated, their labels unreadable. "This was a smuggler's route," he said, his voice echoing off the walls. "They moved things straight from the shore to the house. No wonder the cops never found half of what Costa was accused of hiding." Tiffany was quiet. She had wandered to the far end of the chamber, where the tunnel seemed to continue. There, half buried in the damp sand, was a small wooden crate. It was newer than the rest, unmarked, nailed shut. "Marcus," she called softly. He came over, crouched beside it, and wedged the crowbar beneath the lid. The nails gave with a sharp creak. Inside, wrapped in waxed paper, were a dozen reel-to-reel tapes, each labeled with a date and a set of initials. The writing was precise, almost ceremonial. Marcus picked one up. August 3rd, 1982, VC and ML. He looked at Tiffany. These could be recordings. Of what? He didn't answer. His mind was already racing through possibilities. Business meetings, deals, confessions. He set the tapes carefully back into the crate and noticed something else beneath them. A smaller metal box, locked but not sealed. He opened it with a screwdriver and found inside a stack of photographs and documents. The photographs showed men in suits at the docks, exchanging envelopes, shaking hands with police officers, standing before boats heavy with cargo. Some of the faces were blurred by time, but others were shockingly clear. There were also letters, typed on yellowing paper, addressed to officials, judges, businessmen. Every one of them was signed only with a single initial, V. These were not records of a criminal empire trying to hide, they were a record of a man trying to expose it. Costa, the man once called a kingpin, had been documenting his own downfall. Maybe he wasn't trying to protect his crimes, Tiffany said quietly. Maybe he was trying to confess them. They carried the box and tapes back upstairs as the daylight began to fade. The sky outside had turned a deep steel gray, the ocean restless. Marcus set the items on the dining table and examined one of the tapes. It was still intact, the film wound tightly. "If we can find a player," he said, "we might be able to hear what's on them." But finding one was harder than it seemed. The house had nothing modern beyond their small radio and an old generator that barely ran. They decided to wait until morning, when Marcus could go into town. That night, the sound of the wind against the shutters grew louder. Rain began to fall, first softly, then in heavy bursts. The entire house seemed to sway with the rhythm of the storm. Tiffany woke sometime past midnight. The rain had stopped, replaced by a strange, rhythmic dripping sound. She got up and followed it down the hall to the stairwell. The basement door stood open, though she remembered closing it. She called Marcus's name, but only the hollow echo of her own voice answered. She descended the stairs slowly, her bare feet cold against the stone steps. The basement was darker than before, the flashlight beam weak and sputtering. The tunnel entrance yawned like a mouth, but what drew her attention was something else, a faint glow deep inside it, like a lantern moving slowly. Her breath caught. For an instant, she thought she saw a figure, tall and indistinct, turning away into the darkness. The light vanished, leaving only the sound of dripping water. When Marcus found her minutes later, she was standing frozen at the tunnel mouth. "There was someone down there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He searched the tunnel with the flashlight, but found nothing. No footprints, no sign of intrusion, yet the air smelled different, sharper, as though disturbed by something that had moved recently. They sealed the basement door that night with a board and nails, but sleep refused to come. Every creak and gust felt personal, directed. Tiffany lay awake, replaying the image of the faint light moving in the dark, wondering if it had been real or something conjured by exhaustion and fear. Morning brought no clarity. The rain had washed the beach clean, leaving the sand smooth and untouched. Marcus went into town for supplies and to find an old tape player. The local hardware shop owner, an old man with nicotine-stained fingers, raised an eyebrow when Marcus mentioned the address. "Costa House, huh?" Marcus forced a small smile. "Guess that makes me the fool." "Maybe," the man said, "but if you find anything down there, best leave it be. Some ghosts don't like being dug up." When Marcus returned with a borrowed player, Tiffany was waiting in the kitchen, the crate of tapes beside her. Together they set up the machine on the table. The first tape hissed as it began to spin, and then a voice emerged. Faint, deep, speaking Italian mixed with English. The quality was poor, but the tone unmistakable. It was a conversation, calm but tense. "You think they will turn on us?" one man said. "They already have," another replied. "The money's gone. The port is no longer safe." There was a pause, and then the second voice again, lower this time. "If they want war, they'll have it. But not here. Not in this house." The tape clicked off abruptly. They looked at each other. "That's him," Marcus said. "Costa." He inserted another tape. This one was clearer, the voices more distinct. "Documents in the lower vault must stay. If anything happens to me, burn them. Promise me, Matteo." "I promise," came a trembling reply, but the promise clearly had not been kept. They listened for hours, the tapes unraveling a story more complex than either could have imagined. Costa had begun recording his meetings not for power, but as protection. He had learned that the network he'd built had turned on him, that his own allies wanted him silenced. Each recording was a piece of evidence, a confession, a desperate attempt to preserve the truth. When the final tape ended, Tiffany sat in silence, her mind reeling. "If these are real," she said slowly, "then what we found isn't just history. It's evidence, real evidence." Marcus nodded. "And whoever still protects the Costas, they'll want it back." That night, as the tide rose again, the wind carried with it distant voices, shouts from the cliffs, the growl of engines on the road. Tiffany went to the window and saw headlights lingering far down the drive, too still to belong to passing cars. Someone was watching the house. Marcus joined her, his jaw tightening. "They know," he said simply. The mansion loomed around them, silent yet listening, the air heavy with the weight of what they had unearthed. Somewhere, deep below, the tunnel dripped steadily, the sound blending with the heartbeat of the sea. The secret beneath the sand was no longer buried, and the tide was already turning. The morning after they first played, the tapes arrived without sunlight. The ocean sky was a dull sheet of pewter, the air damp and heavy as though the house itself had absorbed the storm. The mansion stood silent under the weight of that gray light, every surface glistening faintly with condensation. Marcus and Tiffany hadn't spoken much since dawn. They moved through the rooms quietly, as if any loud sound might wake something that preferred to remain asleep. The box of tapes still sat on the table between them, its contents more dangerous than either of them dared admit. Tiffany poured coffee into chipped mugs, her movements slow. "You didn't dream either, did you?" she asked finally. Marcus shook his head. He'd spent most of the night sitting in the library, staring at the waves that battered the cliffs below. He couldn't shake the feeling of those headlights on the road, the way they had lingered like eyes in the dark, watching but never approaching. "Maybe we made a mistake," she said. "Maybe we should have left everything where it was." He rubbed a hand over his jaw, feeling the roughness of 3 days without shaving. "And then what? Pretend we didn't see it? Pretend we didn't hear Costa's voice on those tapes?" Tiffany didn't answer. She looked toward the wide bay window where the sea stretched to the horizon, restless and gray. A single gull circled above the cliffs, its cry thin and mournful. Somewhere within the house a floorboard creaked, slow and deliberate, though neither of them had moved. That sound had become familiar over the past days, soft, distant footsteps that seemed to travel through the house without pattern. Sometimes they came from the upper floor, sometimes from the basement, always fading just as quickly as they appeared. Marcus had blamed the wind, the settling of old wood. But after the tunnel, after the tapes, that explanation no longer satisfied either of them. The house wasn't simply settling, it was shifting, remembering, breathing with the rhythm of the ocean that beat against its foundations. Later that day, Marcus went to the garage, which had long since collapsed into partial ruin. He needed to work with his hands, to do something practical, something that would quiet the storm inside his head. The air was thick with the smell of oil and mildew. Old tools hung from the walls, their metal eaten with rust. Behind a workbench. It took effort to pry it open, and when he did, a cloud of dust and the faint scent of seaweed escaped. Inside were remnants of another life, work gloves, a faded jacket, and a small notebook wrapped in cloth. He opened it, brushing off dirt from the cover. The handwriting inside was elegant and slanted, the same as the letter they had found in the wall safe. It was Costa's. The first pages were lists, numbers, shipments, names, but near the middle, the tone changed. "They will not let me leave. I've given too much, and they know it. The house listens to everything now. I hear voices when the tide is high. I built my empire on silence, and now silence is all that answers me." Marcus felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. He closed the notebook and looked around the garage, half expecting to find someone standing there. Instead, he saw only the dim light slanting through broken boards. He slipped the notebook into his jacket and went back inside. Tiffany was sitting on the floor of the foyer, sorting through a pile of old papers she had found in a desk drawer. "More letters," she said, her voice subdued. "Mostly bills, but a few from people who sound afraid. Listen." She read aloud from one. "They will come for you if they know what you've done. You can't save both the family and your soul." The room felt colder. The words seemed to echo against the high ceiling. They knew he was turning, Marcus said quietly. Costa wasn't just a criminal. He was trying to destroy the system he built. Maybe that's why they killed him. Before Tiffany could respond, the sound of a car engine drifted through the air. Both of them froze. It came from beyond the gate, slow, steady, then stopping. They went to the window. A black sedan was parked at the edge of the long driveway, its windows tinted. The engine idled for a moment before shutting off. No one stepped out. Marcus felt the weight of every second stretch. "Stay here," he whispered, moving toward the front door. Tiffany grabbed his arm. "Don't. We don't know who they are." He hesitated, then nodded. They watched from behind the curtains as the car remained motionless for several minutes before reversing slowly down the road and disappearing beyond the bend. Tiffany exhaled shakily. "They're watching us." That evening, an old man came to the gate. Marcus saw him from the upstairs window, thin, stooped, wearing a long coat despite the mild weather. He stood there without moving, gazing at the house with an expression that was neither hostile nor friendly, just resigned. Marcus went outside cautiously, the gravel crunching under his boots. The man didn't speak until Marcus was close. His voice was rough, cracked by age. "You shouldn't be here." "This is our house now," Marcus said evenly. The old man gave a small, humorless smile. "No, this house doesn't belong to anyone. It remembers its owners, even when the rest of the world forgets. Did you know the Costas?" The man looked past him toward the house. "I worked here once, a gardener. Back before it all went bad, I tended the roses along the south wall when there were roses. The old man was complicated. He built this place to look out at the sea because he thought it would make him clean. But you can't build a home on the edge of a grave and expect peace." "What happened to him?" Marcus asked. The man's eyes shifted back, sharp despite their age. "He tried to do the right thing, but the right thing comes too late when your hands are already stained. His sons ran, his wife vanished. He stayed, waiting for judgment. They say he died here, but no one ever saw a body. Maybe the sea took him. Maybe the house did." Marcus felt the wind pick up, carrying with it the smell of salt and decay. "Why tell me this? Because the people who wanted him dead still have long memories. If they think you've stirred up the past, they'll come looking. And when they come, they don't knock first." The man turned to leave, his steps slow. Over his shoulder, he said, "If you're smart, you'll leave before the next tide." When Marcus returned inside, Tiffany was waiting by the door, her face pale. "Who was he?" "Someone who remembers too much," Marcus said quietly. He told her what the man had said. She listened, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "He's right," she whispered. "We've already seen the car. They're out there." Marcus looked towards the stairs that led to the basement. If Costa was really trying to expose them, then there's more down there. Something he meant to use. We can't just walk away from this. That night, the air changed again. The tide was unusually high, the waves pounding the cliffs like fists. The power flickered, plunging the house into darkness. Tiffany lit a lantern while Marcus went to check the generator. From the tunnel was flooding again. He stood at the entrance, flashlight in hand, and saw reflections shimmering across the wet walls. It looked as if the ocean were creeping closer, reclaiming what it had once owned. He thought he heard a whisper carried on the wind, a man's voice, distant, indistinct. It might have been the sea, but it sounded like words. "Not yet." The next morning, they woke to find the gate open. Fresh tire tracks cut through the wet gravel. Nothing inside the house appeared touched, but a note had been slipped under the front door. The handwriting was neat, unfamiliar. "Leave the recordings. Forget the rest." There was no signature. Marcus read it twice, then crumpled it. "They know we have the tapes." Tiffany's voice trembled slightly. "Maybe we should give them what they want." "No, that's what they're counting on." He set the crumpled paper in the fireplace and struck a match. "If we give in now, this place stays cursed forever." The day passed in uneasy silence. They kept the doors locked, though it hardly felt like protection. In the afternoon, Marcus went to the shed to fix the generator, trying to distract himself, while Tiffany cleaned the second floor. As she dusted the shelves in the master bedroom, she found another letter hidden behind a loose plank. It was addressed in the same handwriting as the others, Costa's. "If you are reading this, then you have already walked too far into the dark. I could not save myself, but maybe you can save what comes after. The proof is buried, not in gold, but in words. I left the last of it where the tide meets the stone. When the sea speaks loudest, it will rise again." When she showed it to Marcus, he looked at the map from the earlier envelope and realized what Costa had meant. The black mark at the end of the tunnel was directly beneath the cliff, near where the waves struck hardest during high tide. "There's something else down there," he said. Something he hid. They waited until late afternoon, when the tide began to retreat. The air was sharp and cold. Together, they descended into the tunnel again, the flashlight beams cutting through the damp air. Water still pooled along the floor, glimmering like liquid glass. They followed the map carefully, past the barrels and crates, until they reached the far end where the rock met a wall of hardened clay. The ocean's sound was loud here, a constant roar beyond the stone. Marcus began to dig with a shovel, the wet earth heavy. After several minutes, the blade struck metal. He scraped away the mud to reveal a small steel chest sealed tight. Tiffany knelt beside him as he forced it open. Inside was a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth, along with several rolls of undeveloped film. The documents were marked with names, politicians, corporations, dates of transactions, bribes. Proof, as Costa had written. Proof of everything. They carried the chest upstairs, both too stunned to speak. When they reached the dining room, Marcus set it beside the tapes. "This is what they were afraid of," he said. "This is what they killed for." Outside, thunder rumbled over the sea, distant but moving closer. Tiffany looked toward the windows where the horizon had darkened into a bruised blue. What happens now? Marcus closed the chest and locked it again. Now we find someone who can make this public. But even as he said it, he knew the danger that came with that choice. The men behind these documents weren't the kind to forgive or forget. The headlights, the car, the note, they were only warnings. The next visit would not be so polite. That night, neither of them slept. Rain lashed the windows. At one point, Tiffany thought she saw movement on the beach below. Figures, dark against the lightning, walking near the cliffs. She blinked, and they were gone. Perhaps they had never been there at all. In the early hours, when the storm eased, Marcus sat by the fireplace staring into the flames. He could feel the house shifting around them, its timbers creaking with the rhythm of the waves. It was as if the building itself approved of what they had done, as though the spirit of its long-dead owner was finally at peace, knowing his secret was found. Yet, outside, the world was far from peaceful. The men who had built their fortunes on silence were stirring once more, and as dawn crept across the gray sky, the shadows that had once claimed the Costa family began to gather again, their eyes fixed on the mansion by the sea and the two people who now held its truth. The wind arrived first, an endless, low moan that carried across the cliffs like the voice of something ancient and hungry. It began before dawn, shaking the windows in their frames and whistling through the cracks of the old mansion. Marcus woke to the sound of it, a deep vibration that the smell of salt was heavy, sharp enough to sting his throat. He sat up and saw the flicker of lightning through the glass, illuminating the restless ocean beyond. Tiffany was already awake, sitting by the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped around herself. "It's getting worse," she murmured. "The waves are reaching the rocks." He joined her at the window. The sea below looked alive, dark, heaving, almost luminous in the white flashes of lightning. The surf crashed against the cliffs with the violence of something personal, as though the ocean had remembered old debts. The radio they kept in the kitchen had gone silent hours ago, the power lines down somewhere along the coast. They were completely cut off. Downstairs, the wind pressed against the front doors until the hinges moaned. Marcus checked the shutters, closing what he could, though many were too warped to latch. The house groaned under every gust, its timbers flexing like a living creature under strain. He could hear water moving in the walls, the same slow, rhythmic gurgle he'd heard in the tunnel days before. The storm was driving the sea upward through the old drains. When he returned to the kitchen, Tiffany had lit several candles and was staring at the chest they had found under the cliff. It sat in the center of the table, metal dull in the flickering light, a silent weight between them. "We can't stay here," she said softly. "If the tide rises any higher, that tunnel will flood. The water could reach the basement." "We'll be fine," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The foundations have held for 50 years. Lightning flared again, followed by a thunderclap so loud it rattled the glass in the cupboards. Somewhere above them, something fell, a long, dragging crash from the attic. Marcus grabbed a flashlight, but Tiffany caught his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "Please, not now." He hesitated, listening. The sound didn't come again. The house was silent except for the howl of the wind and the pounding surf. Still, he couldn't shake the image of that movement upstairs, like footsteps dragging across old boards. But he stayed. For now, the storm was their more immediate enemy. By mid-morning, the rain came hard, driving against the windows in solid sheets. The garden was a blur of motion, branches tearing free, debris flying through the air. The iron gate at the end of the drive slammed back and forth, its hinges screaming. The power failed completely just before noon, leaving them with only candlelight and the dull glow of the fireplace. The tunnel was what worried Marcus most. The memory of the last time he'd gone down there haunted him. The gleam of the barrels, the damp smell, the faint echo of water whispering against stone. Now the storm was pushing that same water higher, flooding the veins of the house. If the pressure built enough, the tunnel could collapse, taking part of the cliff with it. He decided to check. Tiffany protested, but he could see the fear in her eyes, the knowledge that something beneath them was stirring. He promised he'd be quick. With a lantern in one hand and a rope tied to the stair rail, he descended into the basement. The air was colder, thicker. The moment he stepped off the last stair, he heard it, the steady drip of water becoming a trickle. The tunnel mouth glistened, and when he raised the lantern, he saw the water line had already risen several inches. It shimmered darkly, carrying flecks of sand and seaweed. The ocean was coming in. He knelt, running a hand along the damp floor. The vibrations were stronger here, a constant tremor beneath his fingers. The storm was shaking the entire cliff. He could hear the groaning of the rocks beneath the house, like something straining not to give way. Then, faintly, he thought he heard another sound behind the noise of the sea, something metallic scraping in the distance. It was slow, deliberate, like a door being dragged open. He called out, but his voice was lost in the roar of the wind. For a heartbeat, the lantern flickered, and in that flicker he saw movement deeper down the tunnel. A reflection? Or a figure? He stepped forward, but the floor suddenly shifted under his weight. A wave of water surged past his boots, icy cold, knocking the lantern from his hand. It hit the ground and went out, plunging him into darkness. He stumbled backward, following the rope by touch, water rising to his ankles, then his calves. By the time he reached the stairs, it was knee-deep, swirling with sand. He slammed the basement door shut and leaned against it, gasping. "The tunnel's flooding," he shouted. Tiffany ran to help him brace the door. They could hear the water pounding against it, the hinges creaking. The house shuddered, a deep vibration that made the chandelier in the foyer tremble. "We have to go." A crash interrupted her, sharp and violent. One of the windows in the dining room had shattered, blown inward by the wind. Rain and glass scattered across the floor. Marcus rushed to cover it with boards, but the storm's force made every effort useless. Outside, the sea was no longer visible as a horizon. It was a wall of water, climbing higher against the cliffs. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time blurred into the sound of wind and water. They huddled in the parlor near the fireplace, watching the flames twist under the drafts. Every few moments the house would creak, its wooden frame flexing. The wind found new ways to scream through the gaps in the walls. Yet amid the chaos, there was something almost rhythmic about the noise, as though the storm had its own language, an angry, relentless voice that the house was struggling to answer. Tiffany sat close to the fire, her eyes fixed on the chest. "Do you think this is what he meant?" she said quietly. "When Costa wrote that the sea would rise when the truth came out? Maybe this is the house's punishment for keeping secrets." Marcus shook his head. "It's not punishment. It's warning." He got up and crossed to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, he saw the cliffs below collapsing in sections, rocks tumbling into the boiling surf. If the ground gives way. He didn't finish. They spent the afternoon securing what they could, though it felt futile. The roof leaked in a dozen places, and the walls wept. Every gust of wind sounded like a cry. At one point, Tiffany thought she heard voices outside, men shouting, but when she opened the door, there was only the roar of the storm. By evening, the rain had turned to sheets of icy spray, and lightning struck close enough that the ground trembled. The basement door began to bulge inward, water seeping through the cracks. Marcus and Tiffany stacked furniture against it, but they could both hear the sea rising beneath their feet. The tide was at its peak. Then, over the noise of the wind, came another sound, the distant wail of an engine. Headlights appeared briefly at the edge of the drive, cutting through the rain. Someone was coming. Marcus ran to the window. A truck, its tires spinning in the mud, pulled to a stop near the gate. The doors opened, and two figures stepped out, their outlines dark against the lightning. "They found us," Tiffany whispered. Marcus grabbed the crowbar from the fireplace. "Stay here." The front door shuddered as the wind tore at it. He could see the figures moving closer, their shapes distorted by rain. The first man reached the steps, shielding his face from the storm, and pounded on the door. "Mr. Blake." The voice was rough but urgent. "Open up. We're here to help." Marcus hesitated. "Who are you?" "Howard Caldwell. You called about the documents. I got your message before the lines went down." Marcus turned to Tiffany. "It's the lawyer. He's real." She nodded quickly, then let him in. He pulled open the door against the force of the wind, and Caldwell stumbled inside, drenched and shaking. Behind him came another man, younger, carrying a satchel. "My assistant, Eric," Caldwell said, catching his breath. "The storm's taken half the road. We barely made it." "You shouldn't have come," Marcus said, slamming the door shut behind them. "The tunnel's flooding. The cliff's starting to go." Caldwell wiped his glasses. "I didn't drive through this hell for the weather. I came because what you found is bigger than either of you know. Those names in the files, some of them are still in power. If we don't secure that evidence tonight, it might never see daylight." Tiffany stared at him. "You mean to take it now? Through this?" He nodded grimly. "There's a shelter up the coast. If we can get there before the bridge floods, I can have the documents transferred to the press in the morning." Lightning split the sky again, so bright it turned the room white for an instant. The sound followed almost immediately, shaking the walls. "If we're going," Marcus said, "we need to leave now." They packed the tapes and papers into waterproof bags, wrapping them in tarps. The wind howled as they opened the front door, the rain striking like needles. Marcus led the way, carrying the chest in his arms. The path down to the gate was half washed away, mud sliding beneath their feet. Caldwell and Eric followed, their flashlights barely cutting through the rain. Halfway down, a sound like an explosion ripped through the air. The ground lurched, and a deep roar rose from below. Marcus turned just in time to see part of the cliff collapse into the sea, a cascade of stone and water vanishing into the dark. They ran, stumbling toward the truck. The wind tore at them, nearly lifting Tiffany off her feet. Marcus shoved the chest into the back and climbed into the driver's seat. Caldwell was yelling directions, pointing through the windshield. The road beyond the gate was a river of mud, but Marcus hit the gas anyway. The tires spun, then caught, lurching them forward into the storm. The drive was chaos. The headlights barely reached beyond the hood. Rain hammered the glass so hard it was impossible to tell where the sea ended and the sky began. Several times the truck skidded, the tires sliding on slick asphalt. Tiffany clutched Marcus's arm, her knuckles white. Caldwell's assistant was praying under his breath. Then, just as they reached the top of the hill, a shape appeared in the road, a figure standing in the beam of the headlights. Marcus slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded sideways, mud spraying. When they came to a stop, the figure was gone. Only the rain remained. "Did you see that?" Tiffany gasped. Marcus nodded, heart pounding. Probably debris. But deep down he knew it hadn't been. It had been a man, a tall, shadowed silhouette with one arm raised, as if in warning. They pressed on, reaching the main road just as another wave of rain swept inland. Behind them, a sound like thunder rolled through the cliffs, a final collapse. Tiffany turned to look back. Through the sheets of rain, she saw the mansion's silhouette against the sky, its windows glowing faintly with candlelight. For a moment, she thought she saw someone standing in one of them, a tall man in a white suit, looking out at the storm. Then the light flickered, and the image was gone. By the time they reached the shelter, the wind had begun to die. They stumbled inside, soaked and shaken. Caldwell spread the documents across a table, his hands trembling. "You did it," he said. "You actually found it." Marcus sank into a chair, exhausted. "What happens now?" "Now," Caldwell said, "the world finds out what was buried." Outside, the rain still fell, softer now, almost gentle. The storm had spent its fury, but back along the cliffs, where the sea crashed endlessly against the broken rocks, the mansion still stood, wounded, half drowned, but standing. Its windows flickered faintly in the darkness, as though someone within had relit the candles. The ocean roared, the tide rising once more, and in the silence between waves, the house seemed to sigh, a deep, weary sound, like a secret finally spoken aloud. Morning came reluctantly after the storm, a dim and uncertain light creeping across the soaked horizon. The air was thick with mist, the kind that clings to skin and hangs low over the ground like a ghost reluctant to depart. For the first time in 2 days, the wind had fallen silent. The ocean still raged, but its voice was hoarse now, quieter, almost exhausted. The house on the cliffs, if one could still call it a house, stood battered but upright, its broken windows gaping toward the sea like eyes that had seen too much. Miles away, in a small coastal shelter that smelled of damp clothes and gasoline, Marcus and Tiffany sat wrapped in blankets beside a sputtering heater. They had slept only in fragments through the night, haunted by the roar of the waves and the collapsing cliffs. Every time Marcus closed his eyes, he saw the moment the tunnel disappeared, the land folding into itself, dragging history down into the black water. The image refused to fade, etched in the corners of his mind like a scar. Caldwell had been awake since dawn, his glasses fogged as he pored over the documents they had saved. He moved with quiet purpose, spreading them across the long wooden table beneath a single flickering bulb. The papers were damp but legible, and the evidence was staggering. Names, dates, amounts, offshore accounts, police chiefs, judges, senators, entire branches of power connected through the Costa Empire. It wasn't a family legacy, it was a blueprint of corruption. "This will blow the coast wide open," Caldwell murmured. His assistant, a pale young man with trembling hands, nodded silently, typing details into a small recorder. "Half the state has blood on its hands," Caldwell continued. "Costa must have known he couldn't destroy it himself. That's why he left all this behind, for someone else to finish what he started." Marcus sat in silence, staring at the chest that had nearly cost them their lives. The metal was dented now, scraped from the journey, but it still held the weight of everything they had unearthed. "What happens to us if this goes public?" he asked finally. Caldwell didn't look up. "You'll be targets, at least for a while. But you'll also be witnesses. Once the story breaks, they can't touch you without..." Tiffany's voice was hoarse when she spoke. "We don't have anywhere to go." "You will," Caldwell said. "There are safe houses inland. I can arrange it." The heater coughed and went out, plunging the room into cold again. Marcus rubbed his hands together, trying to focus on the sound of his own breathing instead of the endless drone of the sea outside. He thought of the house, the way it had looked the night before they fled, standing against the storm like a wounded sentinel. For all its darkness and decay, it had sheltered them, revealed its secrets to them. It had chosen them in a way he could not fully understand. By noon, Caldwell and his assistant packed the documents into waterproof cases, preparing to leave for the nearest city. "Once I hand these over to the press, there's no going back," Caldwell said. "The Costas' empire will burn, and everyone tied to them with it." Marcus nodded, but unease gnawed at him. "What if the people you're exposing still have reach? What if they stop you before you get there?" The lawyer smiled faintly, though his eyes were tired. "That's the risk of truth, Mr. Blake. Someone always tries to bury it again. But every time it resurfaces, it comes back harder to kill." When Caldwell's truck finally left, the sound of its engine fading into the fog, the shelter felt emptier. Marcus and Tiffany sat together by the window, staring out at the gray coastline. The rain had softened to a drizzle. The world looked washed clean, yet fragile, as if one wrong move might shatter it again. They didn't speak much that afternoon. Words felt too small for what they had lived through. Every now and then, Tiffany would glance toward the sea, her face unreadable. When Marcus finally asked what she was thinking, she said quietly, "Do you think the house is still standing?" He wanted to say yes without hesitation, but something in him hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted, "but even if it's gone, I don't think it's finished." That night, they stayed in a motel near the edge of town, the first proper bed they had slept in since moving to Seabrook. The sheets smelled faintly of detergent and dust. Tiffany fell asleep quickly, but Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The storm outside had ended, but another one churned inside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over, that the house, with all its secrets and pain, still had one more truth to deliver. In the morning, he left Tiffany sleeping and walked down to the beach. The air was cool and clean, the horizon a thin line of pale gold where the sun struggled through the clouds. The tide was low, exposing stretches of wet sand glimmering like mirrors. He walked for a long time, the surf hissing at his feet until the cliffs came into view. At first, he thought he'd gone too far, that he was looking at the wrong stretch of coast, but as he drew closer, his heart began to race. The mansion still stood, damaged, battered, but upright. The western wing had collapsed into the sea, and most of the veranda was gone, but the main structure remained. It looked almost defiant, clinging to the cliffs with the stubbornness of something that refused to die. Marcus climbed the narrow path that wound up from the beach, his boots slipping on the wet stone. The air grew colder as he neared the house. The gate hung open, its iron bars bent. The garden was a wasteland of broken branches and debris. He stepped over fallen beams and shards of glass, his breath misting in the air. Inside, the silence was vast. The rooms smelled of damp wood and smoke. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling. The floor was slick beneath his boots, and in some places the walls had buckled. Yet, despite the destruction, there was a strange serenity to the place, as though the storm had swept away not just the dirt and rot, but the anger that had once lived here. He walked to the foyer, where the grand staircase still rose, fractured but standing. The chandelier lay shattered across the marble floor, its crystals scattered like frozen tears. On the wall above it, the portrait that had once hung there, of Vincenzo Costa and his family, had fallen. Marcus picked it up, brushing away the dust. The glass was cracked, but the image beneath was clear enough. Costa standing by the sea, his sons beside him, his expression solemn, almost resigned. "You did it," Marcus murmured. "Your secret's out. You can rest now." But as he turned to leave, Something caught his eye. The light filtering through a broken window glinted on metal, a small, tarnished plaque mounted beside the doorway. He wiped the grime away and read the inscription. The words were faint but legible. "Let truth be the only heir." He stood there for a long time, the words echoing through him. When he returned to town, Tiffany was waiting at the diner, 2 cups of coffee growing cold in front of her. She looked up when he entered, searching his face. "You went back," she said. He nodded. "It's still there. What's left of it." "Then it's over," she said softly. Marcus sat down across from her. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. Sunlight was breaking through the clouds for the first time in days, washing the streets in a pale, hesitant gold. "Maybe it's over for us," he said, "but not for everyone. Once the story spreads, a lot of people are going to fall." She reached across the table, her fingers finding his. "You did the right thing," she said. "That's what matters." He wanted to believe her, but part of him wondered if the right thing ever came without cost. They had survived, yes, but survival was not the same as peace. The Costas had built their empire on silence, and silence had a way of lingering even after the noise faded. 2 days later, the story broke. Caldwell kept his word. The documents were published in national newspapers, accompanied by copies of the tapes. The fallout was immediate. Politicians resigned, arrests were made, and the name Costa once again filled headlines, not as a symbol of fear, but as the key to unraveling decades of corruption. Marcus and Tiffany watched it all from a small television in the motel lobby. The images flashed across the screen. News anchors speaking of justice, protests outside government buildings, the slow crumbling of a network that had once seemed untouchable. When the broadcast ended, Tiffany turned to Marcus. "Do you think Costa's family ever knew?" "I think they'll know now," he said, "wherever they are." That evening, they returned to the coast one last time. The sky was clear, the sea calm. From the hilltop, they could see the mansion, half lit by the setting sun. It looked different now, less like a wound, more like a monument. The broken windows gleamed in the orange light, and the garden, though ruined, was touched with the first signs of new growth. Grass had begun to push through the cracks of the walkway. Tiffany leaned against him. "What will happen to it now?" "I don't know," Marcus said. "Maybe it'll fall. Maybe someone will rebuild it. But whatever happens, it won't be the same. The curse is gone." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sea caught fire with color, amber, crimson, gold. The wind was soft, carrying the faint scent of salt and something sweeter, like the memory of summer long gone. For the first time since they'd set foot on the property, Marcus felt a sense of calm settle over him. The weight of the past had lifted, leaving only what remained, a chance to begin again. They turned back toward the road, the house behind them fading into the gathering dusk. But as they walked, Marcus glanced over his shoulder one last time. In one of the upper windows, where the glass had somehow survived the storm, a single light flickered to life, small, steady, like a candle burning in the dark. He watched it for a moment, a faint smile touching his lips. "Goodbye, Vincenzo," he whispered. The light held, unwavering, as the waves rolled gently against the cliffs below. And when the wind shifted, carrying the sound of the tide inland, it almost seemed to say that the house, the old, broken, haunted mansion, was finally at peace. Months passed, and the storm became a story people told to measure time. The towns along the coast had rebuilt their docks, patched their roofs, and moved on, as small towns always do, burying tragedy beneath routine. But for Marcus and Tiffany Blake, moving on had a different meaning. They carried the ocean with them wherever they went. The sound of the waves that had nearly swallowed their home, the salt taste of the wind that had carried both ruin and revelation. They had become, in a strange way, part of the story that once belonged to another family's ghosts. The investigation that followed the release of the Costa documents was fierce and unrelenting. Names that had ruled the region for decades fell one by one, their power crumbling beneath the weight of evidence. Newspapers called it the tide of truth, a cleansing wave that exposed the rot hidden beneath polished surfaces. Some praised Marcus and Tiffany as heroes. Others called them fools for meddling in things that should have stayed buried. But, for the first time in their lives, the Blakes felt something they had never known before: peace through purpose. They used the compensation money from a local foundation, created after the Costa scandal, to rebuild what the storm had taken. Not just their lives, but the house itself. The city had offered to demolish the remains of the mansion, calling it unsafe. But Marcus refused. "It deserves a second chance," he had said, standing before. It took nearly a year. Contractors came and went, but Marcus stayed through every stage, lifting beams, clearing debris, learning the structure like a doctor learning the anatomy of a patient. He repaired what could be saved and replaced what could not. Tiffany oversaw the interiors, not to restore the mansion to its former grandeur, but to make it livable, human. Gone were the dark curtains, the heavy drapes, the furniture that reeked of old wealth. In their place came open windows, soft light, and warmth. The locals, who had once crossed the street to avoid talking about the Costa place, began to watch the progress with a cautious fascination. Children would stop on their way to school, staring through the gates as Marcus hammered and painted. The old gardener, who had once warned them to leave, returned one afternoon carrying a small box of rose seedlings. "For the south wall," he said simply. "They always grew best there." Marcus thanked him and planted them himself. When the work was finally done, the mansion looked both older and younger than before. Its scars were visible, sections of stone still darker from the storm, wood that had warped and been sanded smooth, but that was part of its new life. Tiffany stood at the gate one evening as the sun dipped low over the water, the light catching the restored windows. "It's not the Costa mansion anymore," she said softly. "It needs a new name." Marcus looked at the way the glass reflected the fading sunlight, how the beams turned gold before vanishing into dusk. "Then call it the House of Light," he said. The name stayed. Word spread quickly. At first, people came out of curiosity. Reporters, neighbors, a few old friends who couldn't quite believe the place wasn't cursed anymore, but over time, others came too. Families displaced by storms, children who had lost homes, people who needed a roof and a chance. Tiffany had the idea first, to turn the mansion into a refuge, a place for those the world had forgotten. "Costa tried to build an empire," she said one evening as they stood in the restored foyer. "We'll build a sanctuary instead." They opened the doors on a bright spring morning. The first families arrived with nothing but duffel bags and exhaustion. Marcus welcomed them personally, leading them through the halls that once echoed with silence. The smell of bread baking replaced the scent of dust and rot. Laughter returned to the rooms where whispers of crime had once lingered. The ocean breeze that swept through the open windows no longer sounded mournful. It was a song now, wild and clean. The mansion changed with the people inside it. Children painted murals on the walls, bright suns, green hills, endless blue skies. Tiffany organized a small garden on the front lawn, and the roses along the south wall bloomed crimson that summer, their color so vivid it almost seemed impossible. Marcus built wooden benches facing the sea. In the evenings, he would sit there after everyone had gone to sleep, watching the horizon turn dark, thinking of all the nights he'd once feared it. Sometimes, when the wind was just right, he thought he could still hear the faint hum of the tunnel that no longer existed, the sound of water against stone, the heartbeat of a place that had lived too long with secrets. But it no longer frightened him. It was a reminder, a memory folded into the rhythm of the sea. One evening, nearly 2 years after the storm, Marcus received a letter. The return address was from the son of Vincenzo Costa, the younger boy from the old photographs, long presumed dead. His handwriting was elegant, steady. "I saw what you've done with the house," the letter read. "It was never meant to die that way. My father wanted redemption, and you've given it to him. The truth cost him everything, but through you, it found its way home. If the walls still stand, it's because they were waiting for someone worthy to listen." Marcus read the letter aloud to Tiffany, his voice thick. They placed it in a small frame and hung it in the entrance hall beside the plaque that had somehow survived the storm. "Let truth be the only heir." Years passed, but the House of Light never lost its purpose. It became a refuge, then a symbol. Travelers spoke of it as a place where the weary could rest, where the sea's endless roar seemed to soften. Some said it was the house itself that healed them, that the walls hummed with a kind of warmth impossible to explain. Others said it was the people, Marcus and Tiffany, who turned ruin into grace. There were still storms, of course. The ocean never forgave completely. Some nights the wind would rise and the rain would hammer against the glass, reminding everyone that nature remembered. But even then, the lights inside never went out. They had generators, yes, but more than that, they had will. One late summer night, long after the last guests had gone to bed, Tiffany found Marcus standing at the edge of the veranda, looking out over the moonlit sea. The wind played with his hair, silvering it in the soft glow. "You still think about that night," she said quietly. "Every day," he admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if we really survived it, or if we just became part of the house." She smiled and joined him, her hand finding his. "Maybe that's what survival means. You don't escape it, you become what's left." They stood in silence for a long time, the sea murmuring below, the stars caught in the restless water. From the cliffs, the house rose behind them, no longer a fortress of secrets, but a beacon. Its windows glowed softly, casting golden reflections on the grass and stones. The light spilled outward, reaching toward the ocean, as if to guide something home. Marcus turned to look back at it. "You know," he said, "I used to think places like this were cursed, that they absorbed everything bad that ever happened inside them. But now I think it's the opposite. They absorb pain so that people can leave lighter." Tiffany rested her head on his shoulder. "Maybe that's what it's doing for us." Below, the waves whispered against the rocks, steady and patient. Somewhere in the distance, a gull cried and was answered by another. The air was cool, touched with salt and roses. It was strange, Marcus thought, how peace could grow in the same soil where fear once rooted itself so deeply. Before going inside, he looked one last time toward the horizon. The faintest blush of dawn was beginning to touch the sky. The sea looked softer now, almost tender, as though it, too, had tired of violence. He could just make out the inscription on the gate through the dim light, the one they'd added after the restoration. Casa del Luma, House of Light. He smiled faintly. The wind carried the scent of morning through the open doors, winding through the halls, stirring the curtains. The house seemed to breathe again, alive and aware, its walls no longer whispering of loss, but humming with life. Somewhere, deep inside, beneath the foundations and the scars of years, it felt as though the spirit of Vincenzo Costa himself was finally still. Marcus and Tiffany walked hand in hand back through the doorway. Behind them, the sea rolled and sighed, endless and forgiving. Ahead of them stretched the echo of laughter, the clatter of breakfast being prepared, the sounds of people beginning another day within the walls that had once known nothing but silence. The House of Light had done what no storm, no crime, and no secret ever could. It had learned how to forgive. And in its forgiveness, it had finally found peace. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. There's more waiting just around the corner. Watch the next episode to uncover what happens next, and check out our other stories filled with mystery, truth, and redemption. Share this video with someone